Hume considers his arguments regarding the immortality of the soul by turning to the second set of arguments, those for morality. Here's how he thinks the argument for immortality based on morality would go. So the arguments are based on God's justice. This justice is supposed to be interested in punishing the vicious and rewarding the virtuous after their death. Now, one of the criticisms that Hume has of this argument is this, that such arguments assume God has attributes beyond what he exerts in this universe. And his objection is that we're only acquainted with this universe, so how do we infer the existence of these attributes? And this again is an empirical criticism. Similar to his arguments about the problem of evil, he's saying, well, there must be immortality because God has heaven and hell to punish the wicked and reward the virtuous after death. But Hume essentially says we have no empirical evidence for this. So this argument lacks adequate support. Then he presses on to more criticism. Now, in the case of our present life, he claims, the scope and intention of our creation, as far as we can judge, is limited to the present life, and we only look beyond our current, time, and to look to the beyond with very weak concern, he claims. He does note that some people do fear the future, presumably the afterlife, but he alleges that fear would vanish, if not artificially fostered by precept and education. And in sort of an ad hominem attack, he asserts that those fostering such fears do so to gain a livelihood and acquire power and riches in this world. And he's presumably being critical of those who use the power of religion to gain power and riches here. Now he raises an interesting ad hominem attack against them, namely this. They are claiming that what really matters is the afterlife. That is what is truly of greatest importance. That's what matters. But Hume points out, and again sort of an ad hominem criticism, that their zeal and industry are an argument against them. Because if what really, really matters is an afterlife, and not this world, why would they act in such an inconsistent manner and spend so much energy trying to acquire power and riches here when it does not matter? Now, on the one hand, this does have some bite, because if someone is claiming that something is true, but their actions go against it, it's reasonable to, question whether they're hypocrites or not, and it also provides some grounds for being suspicious. So, to use an analogy, if someone says, oh, it's perfectly safe to go that way, and then you say, oh, are you going that way? And they're like, God, no, I would never walk that trail. You might think, well, if they say it's perfectly safe, but yet they're never going to walk it, what's going on here? So, if someone claims one thing and then acts in a way utterly consistent with it, you would have grounds of being suspicious. Now, on the other hand, to say that, okay, someone makes a claim, but they act like it's not true, therefore they're wrong, would be what's called an ad hominem fallacy, a particular type called the tu quoque, or the U2 fallacy, sometimes called the inconsistency ad hominem, where because someone says one thing and does another, it's inferred that they are wrong. But it doesn't follow. A person could, to use this example, a person could be completely right, that what matters is the afterlife, and life here doesn't matter that much, but their actions could be utterly inconsistent. To use an analogy, a person could say that smoking is really bad for you, and tell you definitely shouldn't smoke, and then as they walk away, they could pull out a pack of cigarettes and just start smoking. Now, of course, they're being hypocritical, but they would be completely right. Smoking is bad for you. They just don't follow their own advice. Hume presses on. He claims that it's unjust to confine our concern and knowledge to present life if another infinitely greater consequence awaits. And he raises a question that's intended to be a criticism, and his question is this. Should this barbarous deceit be ascribed to a beneficent and wise being? And so what his criticism here is this. We seem to be pretty much focused on life here and now. That's what we focus on. We're concerned about, day-to-day bills, getting, lunch and dinner, and our concerns are almost entirely here. And if what really, really matters is the afterlife, that seems that it's really unfair of God to have us work this way, to be so concerned about the here and now when it just doesn't matter. To use an analogy, imagine that you're working for someone and they told you to focus all your attention on a particular project, but then you're told the project doesn't matter at all. And they tell you nothing about the project that really, really matters. And that would seem to be, and then when that great project comes due, they're like, why didn't you get this done? And you would say, I didn't know anything about this. That would seem to be deceitful. Now again, this doesn't prove that it's not true, that there's not an afterlife. He's essentially, again, doing kind of an ad hominem against God. If it's so important, the afterlife is so important, God should really tell us a lot more about this. Or so he contends. Now he brings up animals again. Like I said, he keeps sort of bringing them in, even though they're not particularly relevant to exactly what he's talking about. But this is what he argues. He claims that our capabilities are no more than those of animals when compared to, our wants and our time of existence, that we're essentially on par with them. And again, the people he's criticizing doesn't explicitly name them or cite them, because citing things properly wasn't the thing back then, that they don't think animals have souls. So he draws an inference from parity of reasoning. Not parody like making fun of it, but parity on par. When he talked about our good dead friends St. Anselm and Ganilo, we saw the notion of parity of reasoning. The idea essentially is that if you have two arguments that are the same, same structure, same reasoning, if one is bad, the other would be bad too. And likewise, if one is good reasoning, by parity of reasoning, the other one would be good as well. And so what Hume is saying here is that, well, if humans and animals are essentially the same in their capabilities, then it follows that if animals are mortal and don't have souls, then the same is true for humans. And again, this kind of just pops into this section. He then brings up woman, and again, not directly connecting to the whole, justice, etc., but as sort of a side criticism. Now, the people he's going after, they regard woman as inferior to men, which is not an uncommon view, among religious thinkers. And so, again, this is kind of an ad hominem attack on them in the sense that they hold that women are inferior to men, and what he's going to try to do is use this view against them. So here's how he does it. He says, if we assume that people are mortal, and it follows that, again, he's going after people who think that women are inferior, whether he's claiming this himself or not. Some would say yes, some would say that no, he's not. But he's bringing it up for the sake of argument. The people he's criticizing regard women as having inferior capacities. And so he is saying that if people happen to be mortal, we just die, then the inferiority of woman's capacity would be accounted for, because the domestic life requires no higher faculties. But, he says, if we accept the religious theory that there is immortality, then men and women have equal tasks to perform. They have an infinite afterlife to deal with, and the time spent here amounts to effectively nothing. And so, contrary to the people he's criticizing, the powers of reasoning of both men and women should be both equal and vastly greater than they are at present. So his criticism here is essentially, again, as an ad hominem. The people he's going after say women are inferior to men, but both have immortal souls that exist forever. And Hume says that seems like bad reasoning, because if our souls are immortal, then we have an infinite amount of time in the afterlife, and so our powers of reasoning should be equal and infinitely greater. So essentially what he's putting up to people that reject the souls of animals and regard women as inferior is trying to give them a choice they don't want to accept. Namely, in the case of animals, they have to accept, if they buy his argument, which I'm sure they wouldn't, that either animals are also immortal or we're not. Or in the case of women, that women and men are equal or we're all mortal. There is no immortality. And again, he's trying to set it up so the people he's criticizing don't want to accept that. They don't want to accept animal souls. They don't want to accept that women are equal. Then he gets back on track with the moral argument. So here's how he criticizes the key part of the moral argument for immortality. Now again, the argument is made by other philosophers, essentially saying there's got to be an afterlife because God has got to reward the good and punish the wicked. In this world, the wicked get away and sometimes die unpunished. The good often die unrewarded. So justice requires that there be an afterlife. So Hume goes back to trying to defeat that. And his argument here is this. He has multiple arguments. He's kind of thorough. First, he contends that there is no object of God's punishment. How so? Well, he's kind of following Leibniz's reasoning here. If you recall back when we talked about Leibniz, he had that principle of sufficient reason, that ultimately everything traces back to God. So if we accept that reasoning, that every effect implies a cause, and that another, this all leads back to God. So whatever happens is ordained by God. So there's nothing for him to punish because he makes everything happen. Now I typically use a stupid analogy at this point, so why not again? So imagine you have someone playing with a Barbie doll, a Ken doll, and G.I. Joe doll. And they make, G.I. Joe and Barbie have a torrid affair, and then they, say to the dolls, oh, you've been very, very wicked, and they throw them on the barbecue and say, you're burning in hell. And of course that would be stupid, first because they're just dolls, and also because they'd be destroying, kind of expensive, toys. But it'd be really stupid because there's no sense in punishing dolls because they have no choice. It doesn't make any sense to punish them. They don't choose their actions, so they don't merit punishment, and punishing them will not correct their actions, so it has no, value in terms of rehabilitating them. And as far as retribution, well, they didn't do it. And as far as rehabilitation, they can't be rehabilitated, and they don't deserve punishment. So it doesn't make any sense. And so in Hume's view, if God is in charge of everything, we're like the Barbie doll and G.I. Joe and Ken dolls. We have no control. Everything is controlled by God. So to reward us or punish us makes no sense. And Hume says that punishment without proper end or purpose is inconsistent with our ideas of goodness and justice, and no end can be served by it after death. So if we accept that God is the cause of everything, then punishment makes no sense, because it's all God's fault. The only one he should be punishing is himself. Now there are ways to get around this. They try to argue that, yes, God is in charge of everything, but we totally deserve to be punished for what we do. And kind of the usual gambit is, as you might imagine, the free will gambit. That we have free will, and therefore we can choose to do what we want. When we choose bad things, we deserve punishment. But that runs up against the idea that God is, all-powerful, that he makes everything happen. And in theological and philosophical philosophy of religion thinking, everything, of course, as always, comes with a price. Now, his next argument is one of proportion. He claims that we should accept a principle of punishment, that the punishment should be proportional to the offense. Some people accept that, and of course not everyone does. But if we do accept that, the punishment should be proportional, he thinks this whole notion of afterlife punishment doesn't make any sense. Why not? Well, he raises the question, why eternal punishment for temporary offenses? And he claims, and this of course can be debated, that the main source of our moral ideas is reflection on the interest of our society. So should these interests, so short and frivolous, be guarded by punishments eternal and infinite? And his answer is, probably not. Now, continuing the proportion argument, essentially what he's saying is this. Suppose someone's, bad, and they're damned. Well, they're damned forever. They have infinite punishment for infinite time. And that would seem to be a greater evil than the subversion of 1,000 millions of kingdoms, because thousands of millions is just thousands of millions. But infinite is, infinite. And so what Hume is questioning here is the whole notion of infinite punishment. Now, there are ways to work around this. One could argue that, as some do, the punishment is not infinite, that people are punished for a while, and they get a chance at redemption, which would be an alternative view of hell. There's also an argument that was put forth by an American religious thinker who contended that since God is perfect, any crime against God is infinitely bad. And so the punishment for a crime against God, which is any sin, should be infinite. So no matter how small the crime against God, it deserves infinite punishment. And it would be just, at least on that view. Now Hume presses on with some additional side concerns. One is this. Heaven and hell suppose two distinct types of people, the good and the bad. But he notes that most people are in between. And he doesn't really develop the argument here, but what he seems to be suggesting or implying is that if you just have heaven and hell, it doesn't really account for the reality of people. Secondly, he asserts, perhaps falsely, that lenience suits our natural ideas of right, even towards the greatest criminals. So, kind of his implied objection here is that hell is far too harsh. Then he closes with a serious theological problem, which is this. In the time when Hume was writing, infant mortality was very high, and people tended to die, before they were born, shortly after they were born, and as children. Interestingly, though, once a person kind of made it into adulthood, their life expectancy wasn't too bad, actually. And one reason why life expectancy was very low then was because of high infant and childhood mortality. For example, Socrates lived, well until his 70s, and he only died because he drank hemlock. So the concern is, if we have this infinite reward and punishment, what about people who die? Who die, before they're born, who die as children? How does that get sorted out? Now, some religious thinkers came up with the idea of limbo, where unbaptized children would go, and it's a place, not as bad as hell, but clearly not as good as heaven. And so Hume concludes that the religious arguments, in terms of, the need for immortality, for eternal punishment and eternal reward, they do not succeed. And he doesn't conclude no immortality. He concludes that the arguments just really give us no reason to accept the claim. Next, we'll look at his final set of arguments, the physical arguments.